Hello, Dr. John Kavanaugh here, also known as State Senator John Kavanaugh, your instructor. And today we're going to have a roundtable discussion with another group of players at the Capitol. And this group is the press corps, the people who cover the doings of the Capitol for radio, TV, and newspapers. And they're going to give you an idea of how they got into their positions, what they do, how they do their job, and maybe we'll end off by them giving you advice if you were interested in becoming a journalist. What is the best route in today's world? So let me introduce them. I have Mary Jo Pitzel, and she is a veteran reporter with the Arizona Republic, which is the newspaper of record, as they say, here in the state of Arizona. Next to her is someone who is referred to as the dean of
it just means I'm not dead yet.
That's right. That's right. And hopefully this won't be too long, so we'll be able to get you through it before we end. But Howie Fisher, and he has his own Capitol Media service where he does the reporting, and newspapers all around the state, and I suppose other radio stations would have you, purchase the stories from him. So he's kind of a free market guy. Moving around, Hank Stevenson, and he has an online newspaper, or I'm not sure what you actually call it.
Newsletter, if you're cool.
A sletter?
Sletter.
Okay.
Just drop the news.
Sounds good.
Start with the S.
And that's called the Arizona Agenda. And you all should be familiar with that because that was one of the two freebies that I suggested that you subscribe to.
No, you're supposed to pay for it.
Well, I do. I actually pay for mine. But they're students. Maybe some of them will. If you have rich parents, given the fact that, most ASU students really don't pay much tuition after you get all the aid, you could probably chip in, how much is it now?
$120 a year.
Yeah, $120. I did. Hey,
student discount. We'll give it for $99.
Okay, $99. Excellent. Finally, Cameron Sanchez. And when I first met her here covering the Capitol, she was with a print edition, which is really actually all digital now, the Capitol Times, which was, I guess, the omnipotent presence for most of my legislative career. But now there are a lot of competitors in the mix. But now she's switched over to radio, KJZZ. So we're going to start, let's go around the same order, and we'll start with Mary Jo. And tell us a little bit about yourself personally, and basically, what was your journalism career that got you here?
Sure. Well, I'm a longtime Phoenix resident. Can't leave this place because the news is so gripping. There's always stuff to do. But I'm a native of Omaha, Nebraska. I went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Go Huskers. And I graduated with a degree in journalism and French. And, as you can tell, the French degree is useful on a daily basis down here at the state capitol. I live in Central Phoenix and I spend a lot of time working and couple of outside interests, very involved with my neighborhood. I've been in women's choral groups and love to hike and get out into the Arizona wilderness.
Mm-hmm. And journalistically, where did you start in this profession? Were you always in this profession, or was you came later on?
Nope. I got hooked when I was in high school, and I was working on the student newspaper. And then you go to college, and you work on the student newspaper there, and work on your degree. And I've been at the Arizona Republic forever, for a very long time. After like Montini, I'm probably the longest tenured staffer there. And like I said earlier, it's hard to leave. This is, as one of my editors said, a very fertile news environment. And there was, especially the state capitol, where I've been doing coverage, off and on for probably about 20 years.
So did you start off as a reporter, or did you begin in some lower, like, copyright or something?
No, I didn't have to go get coffee for anybody. I always began as a reporter, and I've stayed a reporter because that's where the fun is.
All right. Howie?
Well, like Mary Jo, you start in high school. I was actually a photographer for our high school paper and decided try writing because you don't have to go out and get shot at as much. Went to college in Syracuse, worked for the Syracuse paper. Came out here because I got tired of digging my car out of snowdrifts. Actually, I came out here with no job, and very briefly, I was a Santa Claus at Park Central in 1974. So if, in fact, you were at Park Central in 74, you may have sat in my lap.
Some traumatized children.
You may have peed in my lap, which is why I decided not to keep that job.
Are there photos of this that we can pull out to show the kids?
So I have worked for various operations here, including Sierra Vista Herald, Bisbee Daily Review, where I was the editor, the Star, and the Business Journal, and a few other operations, New Times even. And after getting fired 3 times for pissing off editors and publishers, I finally decided in 1992, I don't work and play well with others. So I started Capital Media Services, and as you point out, it's basically a wire service. Every one of my papers and radio stations pays me a fixed monthly fee. They can run all of my stuff. They can run none of my stuff. They know what they're paying. They know what they're getting. I know what I'm getting, and it's worked out very nicely. At the tender age, I'm going to be 74 this summer. I'm somehow still making a living at it.
Yeah. Well, God bless you. I'm near your age, and I'm not about to stop. So, although my occupation gives me a defined benefit pension, so you are much more on your own wits.
Yes.
All right, Hank, you're a little better about you and your journalistic journey.
Yeah, I went to journalism school, no high school newspaper, but got fired from my college newspaper. And
That isn't easy to do.
I know, I also didn't play well with others. So after that, started freelancing, basically. I decided I wanted to be a Capitol reporter, and I looked at Howie's operation and met Mary Jo. I remember the first time I met you guys, and I was so intimidated as a young cub reporter because you guys are just legendary in what you've been able to do.
He's calling us old.
So were you freelancing then, or were you working?
Yeah, I was freelancing for a couple of little papers, some of the WIC papers, the business magazine down in Tucson, and living in an apartment on Roosevelt for $385 a month or something, and was paying that with freelance checks until I got a job at the Capital Times, worked there for a couple of years, Daily Star, ran the Yellow Sheet, and then struck out on my own, running the Arizona Agenda about 2.5 years ago.
Good. And actually, it's I think it's really one of the more informative digging into the issues sources.
Thank you.
That's why I actually put up my own, well, not my own, I put my campaign money up because that's I'm allowed to do that, you know.
I might have... We're using state resources for the university here.
That's right. It's all for the kids.
Yeah, okay.
That's what we say around here. So when did you first start in journalism?
In college, probably 2008, I started covering politics.
So you've been doing it a long time.
I'm getting older. Yeah, I was old by the time I went to college, too. I didn't go directly there. But
And did you go to college here or out of state?
U of A.
Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Phoenix boy, moved down to Tucson for that.
All right, Catherine.
Okay, well, I grew up in California, and then I went to college in New York, so I'm pretty new to the area.
We're in New York.
Sarah Lawrence College.
Okay.
Yeah, in Yonkers. And then I moved to Arizona because I got a job, which was actually interning at the Republic, and it was just a 10-week long fellowship program. I was covering general Phoenix stuff. No offense, it wasn't, my passion. And then there were a few months where I was looking for a job, and I got a call from Gary at the Cap Times, and he asked me if I could be a politics reporter, and I said, of course I can, which was some bluster. But I just packed my bags and I came right back to Arizona before I even had a place to live. And I started covering the state Senate, and I did that for about 2 years, and this was my beat. And I worked for the Capital Times. And then just in October, my colleague and I went over to KJZZ, and now we're the politics desk there. So we cover everything under the sun that has to do with state politics. So I get to cover more than just the state Senate, but I like to be back, and the Senate generates plenty of news on its own. So I'm sure I'll get to come back for a long time.
So were you a journalism major?
I was not. I actually picked Sarah Lawrence because it doesn't have majors. You get to study what you like. And I wasn't sure if I thought I wanted to be either a social worker or a psychologist. And then, as luck would have it, I got bumped from all of my first choice classes in my first semester. Small class sizes is a double-edged sword. So I ended up in some random classes like German history, and one of them was nonfiction writing. And my nonfiction writing class, for some reason, just took my attention, and I did a journalism assignment. By the end of that semester, I decided that I was going to be a reporter instead.
Well, social work and psychologists, that's often the impetus, a blend of that for journalists. I mean, we all think we try to understand people, and there is an impulse to want to help people by what you're doing. There's also the other side where you do want to afflict the comfortable.
It's true. Well, I could see how psychology, especially abnormal psychology, would be help covering the Capitol. So you always want to be a journalist.
Yeah.
Were you always a journalist?
Always.
Were you always a journalist, or did you want to do something productive prior to that?
You know, I used to make sandwiches and clean pools and those kinds of jobs. And frankly, I probably should have stuck with it. Would have made more money.
Right. But you always aspired to journalism, or did you want to be like a doctor or a cop?
You know, I wanted to be a writer. I knew very early on that I wanted to be a writer in some capacity. And journalism is, one way to make money while doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Writing novels probably out the gate from high school is not, the best life choice. But journalism's at least one half step up from that,
And you were not originally a journalist, but you were into writing?
I kind of got hooked on it. Yeah, I liked writing, and basically in high school, my best friend was on the paper, and so it was her thing, and so I stuck to my thing, which was volleyball, and I figured that I, wasn't going to be interested in journalism because I didn't want to step on her toes. And then, in college, once I got hooked pretty hard. I took all the journalism classes I could. I took a bunch of internships, and I wrote for my school paper.
Mm-hmm. So let me switch over to our more senior members. So when I first came to the Capitol here, which was like in 2006, right, the newspapers were king. I mean, the editorial endorsements were big. You didn't want to get slammed with a negative article. It was like, And now it's like, in fact, the Arizona Republic doesn't even do legislative endorsements anymore. And I guess it's because of the internet. I mean, you just wound up with this major shift to internet-based news and reporting, which I guess, A, created more competition, and B, probably was a massive drain on ad revenue, which is what funds the staff and everything. So what big are the changes as big? Is it a challenge? Are there enough people covering us, or, not to put you on the spot with your boss or anything?
Well, I mean, I remember a time when the Republic's bureau at the state capitol was 5 people. We're 3 people now. That's pretty good. I mean, by the standards. But overall, because of the internet, because of the ability to advertise online, that took away a lot of revenue from your standard newspapers. So you had less coming in for the print product. And that, trickles all the way down to staff cuts. I mean, I've been through so many layoffs, staff reductions, and combining jobs. But I will say, I credit our editors for keeping a focus on the importance of government coverage. And that's why we still have 3 people at our bureau, which is, again, rather stunning.
And it's not just the Republic. Now, where we are used to be the press room.
Yeah, that's right. I remember you were kicked out.
We were kicked out because we were underfoot, God help us. It wasn't just the Republic with 5 people plus a columnist who was out here, which was Bernie Wynn. Phoenix Gazette had 4 people here. Phoenix Gazette is God. Arizona Daily Star had 2 people, 2 during session, 1 off session. They're not covering the place. Mesa Tribune had a full-time reporter out here. Scottsdale Progress had a full-time reporter out here. Tucson Citizen had a full-time reporter. Tucson Citizen, gone. Scottsdale Progress, which was then an independent paper under John Marshall, had a full-time reporter, gone. We also had people in a radio room. KTAR had a full-time reporter. KFII had a full-time reporter, and even Channel 15 for a while had a full-time reporter out here. So it's not just the Republic. The industry has shrunk. The scary thing from my perspective is while we were all competitors, we need eyes and ears on what is going on here. And while we're competitors, we also recognize that nobody can cover anything. What scares me every year is there are, 1,800 bills introduced every session, más o menos, 300 to 400 of which become law. Well, not so much under Katie Hobbs, but that's another discussion. What always scares me is when I look at the bills that get enacted, I say, how did we miss that? How did we not cover it? Could we have changed the outcome of that with some publicity?
But you know why that happens a lot, because we're driven by what sparkles and what dazzles and what creates conflict. Yes. And a lot of the bills that pass, believe it or not, shocker, have some level of bipartisan support.
Yeah.
And when there's not conflict, we are not drawn to that as much. I mean, we should be covering policy better.
Well, hey, it's kind of unusual that a lot of surveys show that the public as a whole considers the legislatures to be like a troop of clowns. Although when people poll about their individual representative, it's often kind of held more in high esteem. And I think that's because the more outrageous bills, which aren't going to get into law at all, and the more flamboyant members tend to get a lot more of the coverage.
And that would not include you on any of your bills, of course.
Thank you for saying it, Howie.
Well, some bills, as my students know, bills have certain. Not every bill is put purely for the purpose of becoming law. Bills also have political purposes.
I'm shocked, I tell you, shocked.
But all right, so you're kind of like the newer type reporting, the alternative, if you will, that's kind of eating in there. How do you get your market? I mean, you create this online, what do you call it, a sled?
Newsletter.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, how do you actually get people to even find out about you?
I mean, we've done it all word of mouth. Everything we've done has just been pure word of mouth. And, you know, as the daily papers, like you mentioned, the Bisbee paper, like that's not even a shell of a newspaper anymore. There were all these papers all around Arizona that not only, you know, send people to the Capitol, but just existed. And as those have, you know, dried up and died out, a lot of journalism has moved to the nonprofit model. And you've seen these new organizations pop up in Arizona. Some of them are great. You know, the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting, the Arizona Mirror does a great job of covering the Capitol. And they didn't exist 5-6 years ago. But we're one of the few that is trying to do this as a for-profit operation. We don't, you know, rely on handouts from the powers that be. We rely on our subscribers. We don't make hardly any money off of advertising. And that kind of creates a whole different model than I think exists in a lot of ways, where we are subscriber first. You know, my goal is to not get as many eyeballs as possible. It's to get the eyeballs that care enough to pay for this kind of thing and are like following along and paying attention, or at least want to. And so what we try to do is kind of bring them into this fold. You know, I worked at the Yellow Sheet for years, and that's a $300 a month insider daily newsletter for lobbyists. And when we struck out to do the agenda, we said, you know, that's not what we're doing. We want to take, you know, the value of a publication like that, of kind of like knowing the scene of the Capitol, and then, you know, not dumb it down, but make it accessible for a person who is not a professional politician. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, as the newspaper industry collapses, it's sad, it's terrible, we're losing really important things. But it also creates these, you know, little niches and opportunities for new people to try new things. And I think what we're doing is different.
Do you take on interns if people are interested?
Interns are more trouble than they're worth a lot of times.
What about your most famous?
Oh, yes. My most famous intern, ChatGPT, our art.
Oh, yes.
Intern.
Yeah.
I'm willing to take on interns. I actually just had a high school student reach out to me and say, I love the agenda. Is there anything I can do there? Can I wash your dishes?
You take on paid interns?
Yeah. I wouldn't unpay an intern. But, you know, that's kind of a rare thing. He reached out and had that gumption and that drive, and I like that.
But let me go to his point about interns, because, you know, I've got Bob Christie, formerly of Associated Press, working with me. Well, no, believe me, not an intern. But, you know, from time to time, I'll get a call from somebody. The problem becomes, particularly in this beat, we're not only having to get them used to things, but there's so much that is intricate that it almost takes as much time for me to work with an intern and do what that intern needs to understand the issue and work with that person's writing as it does for me to do it myself. And it's a very tricky kind of balance. You know, you got to find somebody who's interested in the depth that you do and that we all do, but that doesn't require constant hand-holding. But again, the industry has changed. You know, we talk about, you know, newspapers disappearing. Look at the model of newspapers. Newspapers involve cutting down trees in Canada, processing them with harsh chemicals, bringing them here to put ink on paper from news that is written the prior afternoon, then having somebody go out in a car and use gasoline to deliver yesterday afternoon's news that morning. Doesn't make sense. The tricky
You
part-
forgot me. I was a paper boy.
Well,
It's thrown on the side of the street. You fit it in your bike.
But what happened was that with a few exceptions like Wall Street Journal and New York Times, all of us in the industry thought, well, we'll give it away and then people will come to the paper. Online. And all of a sudden people said, well, why am I paying for a paper? And then putting up a paywall later, which Republic is doing, Star and some of the papers are doing, is trickier because people say, wait, I can do a Google search and find that same information somehow, somewhere else that somebody else has hijacked.
Yeah.
And we've all got to figure out a model that makes it work. Hank has come up with a model that makes it work. Radio is a different thing, particularly public radio, where you're depending on grants and you're depending on listener support and all the rest of the stuff. For the newspaper industry, they've got to find a model that people are willing to pay, that they recognize that there are people like Mary Jo who have years of experience that you're not going to get somewhere else. Again, no disrespect to my baby colleagues here, sorry. But the fact is, there are things, Mary Jo can walk into an education story on Title 15, one of the most complicated titles in the ARS, and can understand in terms of Group B weights and how this works and how the Prop 123 extension works. You can't always do that. You can't have folks coming in here or even TV stations, which, sort of drop in and parachute in and say, oh, hey, something's going on with education. But you have to pay for that.
Yeah. Well, before I get to Cameron and her radio aspect, TV is a totally different animal. I don't have anybody from TV here, but I mean, I was born and raised in New York, and we're all sorts of TV stations, major stations. When I was a cop, if there was a news story on the street, it would be a cameraman, somebody carrying sound equipment. There'd be somebody, with a boom microphone. There'd be the producer. I mean, like a van pulled up. Now I get a Cronkite News intern with her phone, and it doesn't actually look that bad once they do
Better
it.
than going to someone's,
But yeah, I mean, there are big changes in that. But now you did print, and I think today we can call online print too, because I mean, I read my Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Republic on my Kindle, so it's all digital. But you went from the written to radio. So what percentage of what you do is actually radio versus going to that website and reading news articles? And is it a different approach or that you have to use with radio versus?
Yes, and yes. So back in college, when I was at Sarah Lawrence taking up all their journalism classes, I did take one in podcasting and one in just basic radio, and I really, really liked it. So at the Cap Times, I was poking and bugging my editors for years to let me do radio stuff and a podcast, and they said, well, we don't have the money for that or the time for that, but, with KJZZ, we have our own political podcast now, which is super fun. Plus, I get to do as much radio as I like, more than I like. And it's, I think, a valuable medium because it adds that extra element, and I get to play along with the sound, and you know what I'm talking about, how I think there's so much more added with like the tone of things and the inflection and the noise of things. And my writing for radio is very different, and that's something I've had to adjust to.
How so?
Well, first of all, it's way shorter, and that's torture for me because I'm trying to explain an issue like, the elections fixed deadline issue. I have 35 seconds to do it, including, the clip of whoever I interviewed.
That's why she speaks so fast.
Yeah. So I'm like, how the heck am I supposed to explain to a listener who's just driving to work, who doesn't know anything about the Capitol, who these people are and what they're trying to accomplish and why it matters, And so writing for the ear is very different. But then we have to do web stories to go along with everything because we do have digital, kjzz.org, and you can go and look up the story, and then there's supposed to be an article with photos and stuff. So I'm also trying to take pictures, and I'm also, whenever I do a radio spot, writing web copy to go along with it, and then I have to switch it back from the radio script back into my print mode, and add in all the details that I couldn't squeeze into my 30-second spot there.
And there's another big difference. With newspaper, there's the old saying, it's called inverted pyramid. You take your most important thing to grab your reader, and then as you get further down the story, in case people lose interest, less important, in terms of a cop story or anything else. Radio, you're telling a story. It's sort of once upon a time, and it to the extent that it's not inverted pyramid. It's supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
It kind of depends. So yes, And there are things called features in radio, which is the longest thing we're allowed to do, which is about 4 minutes. And that's when I get to actually, flex my muscles a little bit and do some work. When we do stuff for NPR, because NPR is an affiliate of ours, they always want us to have features that start off with like a hook, like a story, like, you're in the room hearing the rustling of papers.
Yeah.
Someone starts in with a calm, soothing tone. Like NPR is writing friggin' novels or something.
They're on different drugs there.
They are on different drugs there, and they really want you to set the scene. And it's fun, but it's very different than the breaking news stuff, the inverted pyramid, this person did this thing for this reason, and we're out.
I don't want to tell you how old you made me feel when you said that you took a college course in podcasting. Like, oh my God.
Podcasting's great.
Well, I know, but it wasn't even known when I was in college,
Right. Yeah, there's been a lot of
We had AM and
evolution.
FM radio,
We didn't have FM much.
I was in New York, so.
But there has been a lot of evolution. I mean, even though I work for, a mainstream, still viewed as a print publication, we went online years ago. We've been asked to, we all now take a lot of our own photos, again, sort of because of staffing issues. I'm a co-host of our politics podcast. We went through the whole blog era where we, had to keep up blogs. We do.
Blog era. That was a good era.
Yeah.
We started a newsletter.
Newsletters led to things like.
Let's get into how you do your job. So you're with a big statewide newspaper. Is it like in the movies where you come to work in the morning, you go into an office, and there's this heavy guy in a fedora with a cigar, and you go, all right, cover this.
And a bottle of whiskey in his bottom drawer.
No, I might be tenured and old, but I've never.
And by the way,
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that you cover state government and not the legislature?
Yeah, state government, which extends to the legislature. I mean, but personally, I'm interested in a lot more of the policy, but that often gets over.
Then obviously, if we're doing a big bill like abortion we did yesterday, you're obviously you don't have to be told to be there. But what otherwise, do you think up your own stories? Does an editor tell you? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a blend. I mean, the best situation is when you can drive your own agenda. So, you come up with ideas, you pitch them. Because we're covering a process at the legislature, you say, oh, look at this bill is on the calendar today. I want to write about that. So you're driven by that. And then the editors, will weigh in. They'll, and now they are increasingly focused on, what will really grab audience attention, so anything on immigration, anything on abortion, anything on vouchers, will grab, will have stronger editors.
Do you have quotas? Does the editor say, pencil, I need 40 column inches. I need it by 3. How does that work?
Good luck getting 40 column inches
Yeah.
in the paper.
No, but sometimes they will say get it by 3 because of deadlines. But no, there are not quotas.
Sure. By the way, do you have to be able to touch type, or is it all like voice diction now?
Oh no, I mean I'm a lot faster on the keyboard than.
All right.
No.
Yeah.
Now, and Howie's always got his little pad
Notepad.
there. So do you do steno? Is that?
Well, no, let me put it this way. If you can, I keep waiting for somebody to subpoena my notes. If you can read these notes, you can have them. But it's old habit again. I started in the business. Started college in 67. I started in the business in 70, 71. I am old school. I will plead guilty to that. I don't use voice dictation. In fact, it's even when I get audio of somebody who I've talked to, I will go back and I will transcribe it versus using, the software. I am old.
By hand, Howie?
By hand. I know. I am showing my age, but it's been an evolution. You're right. My first editor was a guy named Alisher Mead at the Syracuse Post-Standard, who had a bottle of whiskey in his bottom drawer. Who would just
Happy Van Winkle.
This is all pre-internet. He'd be opening his mail and he'd see something, and God forbid you didn't look busy because he'd shout, "Fisher, rewrite this." That's part of it. Then, of course, once you get a beat, you make your own beat. When you're covering the cops beat, you've got the scanner in the car and you're going out and, you're getting the police and the fire and the rest of it. But now you're right. It's a matter of what will grab readers' attention. There are things that are by definition important, like abortion, like immigration. But there's also what we call clickbait. The fact that David Cook had a bill about ticket sales after Taylor Swift fans couldn't get tickets to our Glendale concert. That was clickbait.
No, that's not clickbait. I disagree. I think that really relates to people's everyday
Because
experience.
Taylor Swift is that the click? It's Taylor Swift or?
Well, but partly because you're right.
Yeah.
Everyday people who can't get tickets.
But we care about it more because Taylor
Because it's
Swift elevates.
And then there are oddball bills. You know, you've had a few of them yourself where you've introduced something and I say, okay, I can get this on the front page, or I can get
Any
people to
Kavanaugh bill, you can get it on
So
the front.
can we turn the tables on you and ask you about your
was that-
strategy on that?
I mentioned it to you before we started. My motto is all publicity is good unless you're in handcuffs. Because the bottom line is legislators are down ballot, right? I mean, statewide, Congress, big time. Everybody knows them. Under that, who are these people? You know,
Yeah.
I'm buried, amongst judges and sanitary district people. So even for somebody like me, I've been here 18 years in this legislature. It's not, 6 years I'm at Fountain Hills Town Council. I have a lot of people who know me, but when I go outside of Fountain Hills, so they get there. Representative Kavanaugh. That name sounds familiar. And how does that name sound familiar?
Repetition.
Because you write articles about some of my bills. So
I will say, since Katie Hobbs was elected, there have been some bills that we call, veto fodder. Stuff that we know is partisan that's not going to get signed. And
none by this guy, of course.
never. No, but I like to focus.
mine won't get signed for the next 2 years. But if there's a Republican
Yes.
governor up
And then
there, I could just dust those babies off. But go ahead.
But I like to cover things like water and housing, things that might have some bipartisan support and some bipartisan opposition. I find those really interesting. When you've got a bill with some Dems and Rs on it in favor and some Dems and Rs on it opposed, I think those are fascinating. And I think, some of those kitchen table issues, housing in particular, is just like one of my favorites. And I make an effort to cover those things because I think it does a service to our listeners because those things might actually get signed and have.
But you also, and you know this as well as everybody, you have to have what you want to call it the hook, something to make people interested. If the issue has to do with building duplexes and triplexes, and all of a sudden, the radio listeners are tuning that dial. But you got to have something to get people into it, and you've got to, sometimes with newspapers, it comes with a grabber lead. It comes with the kind of intro that you need into a story. So we all recognize that while we may have the most brilliant story in the world, we have the most brilliant feature in the world, if nobody's reading or listening to it, it doesn't matter.
It's a great example of that. Speaking about housing, very important topic. But the bill that was called God in my backyard, that got people's attention. That bill would have allowed churches who had big properties to put up housing, on their lot.
Yippee. Yes, in God's backyard.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were talking about my famous quote that the Dems did a complaint on me. God in the gallery.
Ron Geller.
Oh, it's a good one. It's an old one. You might have missed that one, but anyway. All right. So you do a lot of your own selection, but you got an editor who's also steering you around. Yeah. You are both the editor and reporter.
And believe me, there is something wonderful about self-employment. I mean, it's a little scary at the start in terms of trying to find the clients and finally got them lined up. But I get to pick and choose my own stories. Now, I will hear from editors. We have this going on. Can you do something? And if I can, I will try to. But there are other times I say, that's a great story. Have your reporter call me and I will help him or her find that story. I like picking and choosing the things I want. Look, there's certain things we're all going to write. We're all going to write the State of the State speech. We're all going to write that Katie is going to sign the abortion bill. We're all going to write what's going to be on the ballot. We're all going to write about immigration. But beyond that, it gives us a chance to pick and choose. And what's interesting is among the four of us here is that you also see that on a particular day, we will have four different stories of what we thought was important that day. If it's not something that's overarching like an abortion vote. And that just shows that there is no, people talk about packed journalism. And, when you have people like, Jake Hoffman standing up on the floor and saying, you in the media, like we're some, cabal. It isn't that way. We all have our own ideas of what is news, what is interesting, what we like to cover, and what we think is important.
Mm-hmm. But you have a slightly different type of coverage in that
I'm
you
just here for the scandals, the sex, the drugs.
Yes, because I don't go to you to find out what's happening in the Capitol because you don't cover all the big stories, but you focus on kind of different nuances to it. What is?
A lot of what I do is kind of like looking at what everyone else is doing and trying to find what I think is missing from that. Because there's, for a lot of reasons, even if we're covering the same things, we are such a small pack these days that like there are things that just don't get covered. Even from, the abortion vote or whatever. You got 6 minds on a pretty monumentous event, and they're all going to come away with something different. And so I try to like look at what's out there and say, what is missing, and how can I take what is out there and explain this to somebody who doesn't read a newspaper.
So Mary Jo and Howie, and I think Cameron, like you tend to be down here walking around, in the hearing rooms, trying to,
Best way to do it.
talk to but you're doing a little. You're almost kind of like picking off. Not that I'm saying you're AI regenerating their stuff, but you're looking at kind of everything that's going on, and I think you're looking at their stuff. And is that how you kind of get your ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I spent years of my life down here, and I loved what I did when it was nitty gritty, quotes and facts reporting. But I'm trying to take a different view, like kind of a larger view of, what is politics, government policy in Arizona. And that means not spending my day in a hearing room listening to John Kavanaugh about this one bill that's going to take us 2 hours, So I try to I know that Cameron's going to be there. I know that Mary Jo is going to write an awesome story on that thing. So if I can kind of look at the big picture and say, that's being covered, that'll be covered eventually. Nobody's going to get to this. I try to go for those.
But one thing I like about the agenda, besides the fact that it comes to me and it's unavoidable, is that you will have your original reporting, often, an interesting story, and then you'll have a bunch of stuff that you thought was interesting and you'll give credit to other journalists and link to it so you can sort of see when you open it, here's what happened yesterday and here are all the links if I'm interested in learning more about it.
It's a really broad view of what media.
Plus, I love seeing my name in the agenda. I always get excited.
That's the number one reason we have subscribers is because they're reporters who want to read their name. And
I love it. Yeah.
Damn, I can't believe I have competition. Do you? How about you? I mean, do you have an editor that's directing you, or?
I have a few. I have an editor, and then I have his editor, and then I have his boss. So it's myself and
back to DC NPR.
Well,
Right?
NPR. So I am not employed by NPR, but we have this symbiotic relationship where they sometimes get to use our stuff, and we sometimes get to use their stuff. So everything I do goes through usually Ben Giles, who's my direct editor, and he's another Cap Times alum. He had my job.
Incestuous family, you people.
There's a lot of hip hopping around the journalism world, yeah.
But I assume you also have a whole new avenue of career advancement in that. I guess if they like what you're doing, you could wind up, being, on All Things Considered or whatever.
We've had.
Be Nina Totenberg.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
Okay.
That's not exactly my goal for right now, but it is cool to be on the national audience. NPR doesn't take everything that happens in Arizona, of course, not every turn of the screw, but some things like abortion, they wanted us, because we're already covering it, to submit some pieces to them, and that's...
National is unique. I had my, maybe 1 year of national with SB 1070.
Oh.
Where I was always 1-2 times a week, I was going to this studio in Tempe, where they were doing national feeds for CNN, MSNBC. It is real. It's scary. I mean, you sit in a chair like this, you feel like you're in an interrogation room. You just have a light in your face, and then and this will be 90 seconds or 120 seconds, and boom, you're on national TV, and then people back east call, I saw it on TV. It really is kind of an ego booster, but a bit scary in the beginning. But yeah, I should go there though. It's good. All right. All the President's Men, Woodward, Bernstein, right? They couldn't write anything until they had verification, right? Right. Now, obviously, there are a hell of a lot of websites today that are so-called news because somebody could put up a website and write whatever they want. But where all kinds of unverified crap comes out, but how does that work with you guys?
Well, at the Republic, we can't, all our sources have to be named. We can't, no, it is very rare that we could quote somebody who, anonymously. It's just not, it's not good for transparency. And you've got to have verified sources and you check things out. I mean, that's, even though we have a depleted editing corps, that's part of the editor's job, is to make sure that you've got this and you're not just doing BS.
It's tricky. In my entire career, 8,723 years, I think I've used an unnamed source 5 times.
You did proof the 10 Commandments, didn't you?
Yeah, yes, it was. It was originally 15 commandments, so he dropped one. Old joke there. But for example, I'll give you one that was when I knew that Janet Napolitano was going to name Chris Mays to the Corporation Commission. She had a vacancy. I had Janet as a source who couldn't be named, and I had Chris as a source.
Naming her now?
Yes. Well, again, it was, let's just say it's
Statute of limitations. The statute of limitations.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, and I had to convince editors that these are not just people who are doing something to advance something. This was going to happen. The governor was going to be in Prescott and do the event. That's where Chris was born. She was going to be there, and so I finally talked them into that. But I'm like Mary Jo. I don't like using unnamed sources because people will say, "Well, who's your source? What acts do they have to grind?" If I name a source, then people can say, "Well, if my source is John Kavanaugh," they'll say, "Well, that's John Kavanaugh because he's got a background as a cop and he does this and that," and they can judge it. So it's there's no reason most of the time to use it. It's lazy. It is lazy to use unnamed source. It means you haven't gone out and done your work. And most of the time, this stuff can be verified. You just have to do the legwork.
I'll counterpoint that. So I worked at the Yellow Sheet for years, which uses anonymous sources all the time.
The name literally speaks of yellow
It
journalism.
comes from the Onion paper that it was originally printed on, not Yellow Journalism.
Okay.
Fun fact, didn't know that one either. But I'm comfortable using anonymous sources, and I get, all the reasons not to, but I think it provides my readership with valuable insight that people just won't say on the record. There are so much petty bullshit bubbling below the surface in this building that I think people should know about, and that people, the people who work in this building won't say if their name is attached to it, but you can get to a different layer of truth through unnamed.
But does the bar go a little higher when it's something which would defame somebody?
Yeah, I mean, there's points, and there's times where it's to me perfectly acceptable to use an anonymous source, even just to add a little pop of color. And there's certain times where you just know that it's that it's not the right moment. So you kind of have to figure out what you're comfortable with and what instances you're willing to use unnamed sources. But really, I think that has allowed me to say so much more than the newspapers are able to say about what's really happening down here. And that's really my goal. And I've never shied away from the kind of tabloid side of journalism. I enjoy that stuff. Like I said, I am here for the sex and the scandals. That is fun to me.
But you're here to cover the sex and the
Yes, and not doing drugs personally either, just writing about the drugs.
But if I can go one layer deeper on the Onion, the use of the Yellow Sheet was on onion paper. Is that yellow colored?
Allegedly, yeah, real thin.
Yeah. I believe, I'm speculating now, that they used that so it couldn't be photocopied.
Maybe.
Because when I taught at ASU back in the 90s, the bookstores used to sell class notes. In other words, they would hire people to take notes in Intro to Psych and stuff like that. And they sold the class notes for the different professors, and they had it on this purple paper, because if you try to photocopy it, you couldn't read it. So I think that's probably what it is there.
I didn't even know that.
Same thing with verification. Anything, Nick?
Yeah, I think the question started off as editors, but I'll talk about anonymous sources. So I worked at the Yellow Sheet as a reporter because when I was at the Cap Times, we all contributed to that, and it's very different using Railbirds because people will come to you and they're very this might be a little harsh, but a lot braver when their face isn't being put to it and say, I have lots of, juicy things to say about so-and-so. And, you lose that when you go into like the Republic, or for me, we don't really do anonymous sources. Almost
Putting microphones in front of people.
Right.
You can disguise their voice. That's it. We have the voice recognition software.
So people clam up a little bit, and that's frustrating. Especially like the Washington Post, for example, they get to take some more license than we do, and it's an extra element that we don't get to use. But I understand why we don't do it, and I respect that. And I think, generally, like how he said, if you really do some legwork, you can still get to the meat of the story. And there are, of course, cases where, like, if someone's afraid of retaliation in a certain way, you're allowed to use anonymous sources.
Okay, like a whistleblower.
Yeah, well, like I'm scared of getting murdered if my name comes
Oh,
out.
that's a good excuse. By the way, I wrote a book for this course, but I didn't include the definition railbirds. You just threw that in.
Railbirds.
But you would just explain that for the students.
Sure, railbird is what the yellow sheet calls their anonymous sources, and they've got plenty of them. It's people who will call in and share their gossip, and we refer to them for some reason as just a capital railbird said.
It's because they used to hang around the rail on the, the rotunda? In the old Capitol.
Well, but it goes back even farther than that. I mean, the idea of a railbird are the staff who we generally can't quote, sometimes the lawmaker who was trying to plant something. But if you use the word railbirds, I think there's a general understanding it's somebody who's in a position to know because they're watching, whether as a railbird or something, but as opposed to some fool out in Apache Junction saying, "I heard this."
Okay.
Well, and that's the other thing. Like, when I'm using anonymous sources, one, I know who they are. Two, I don't talk to, I have people from back east call me all the time. Like, I want to talk off the record. And I just say no. I just hang up on them. I don't need that in my life. I have plenty of friends.
Okay. So talking to the people like you guys, you don't use anonymous at all. How do you cover a story where, say, one politician or some political player like puts out a hit piece or otherwise states some really horrible fact about an opponent or a candidate, like he was convicted of this or he did that or whatever.
But why do you need an anonymous source? Again, there are ways. Look, we've had lawmakers recently, who've been thrown out of here for something they did. Look, David Stringer, we're going back to his college days of something. There are always folks who will get you the documents. Now, they may get them to you anonymously.
Right.
When we get a police report, what was it, out of Baltimore on David Stringer, there are ways to verify.
Okay. But so in other words, you wouldn't print that X accused this candidate of whatever, having, 3 legitimate children, unless you could independently verify that fact?
Or name the source.
Or we could,
Yeah.
for example, Representative Jevin Hodge, who was here briefly as a state lawmaker, I got a phone call from a friend of this young woman who said that I forget what was the term, but he had sexually violated her during their college days. That was about almost 10 years ago. And I'm like, well, and she didn't want her name used, and nobody would know who she is anyway, because she's from Boston. She has no connection out here. But I said, I need documents. And it took a while to get that story out.
Okay. But you had to have some.
Once you had documents, documents are, are a very good defense. And so if somebody runs up to you and says, yeah, so-and-so, I'm not going to run with that unless I can prove it. And maybe you'll lose the race to be first, which is infuriating. But you want to make sure you have it right. And especially when it comes to issues of, that could lead to reputation defamation.
And there's another side to that, which is, I think we all found surprising. It is amazing when you go up to somebody, you ask them, "Did you do that?" They will say, they will yes, but.
Uh-oh.
The other thing, and
Good tip. I have to remember that one.
Here's the other thing, and this is a radio trick, which is if you go up to somebody with a microphone and you ask them a question, and they answer it, and you just stand there with the microphone. They feel the need to keep talking. They can't help themselves, and it's amazing what comes out when they're just so afraid of the silence. Same thing on the phone. You ask them a question, they answer, and you go, and they They can't help themselves.
And that, by the way, when I was a cop and I taught the police academy, that was one of the things that you taught in terms of courtroom testimony. In that, if somebody asks you a question and you can say yes or no, you say yes or no, and that is it.
Yeah.
And then they're going to pause, you know, and
you're gonna
that's when they're waiting for you to unravel and spill your guts. Yeah, that's true.
Could I toss a question to you? Because you've been a lawmaker for a long time, and my experience is that, you know, every new crop, it's so hard to get some of these lawmakers to speak to you, and access is not as good as it used to be. You know, when I first came down here, do you provide any advice to newer lawmakers on how to deal with the media, and what's your view of how the media is perceived by your colleagues?
Well, that's actually, you know, this is the first time I'm teaching this course on the state legislature, and I looked around for a textbook on state legislature. There's plenty on Congress, but I looked for a state, and there was none. It's none that was any good, really, you know. So I actually, so I wrote my own, because it's really easy to do a book with Kindle now.
Can we get a signed copy of that?
Well, it's going to come out. It'll come out in a month or two. And because you were nice enough to be here, I will send you a copy. But I do have a section on, you know, communications, you know, like that.
Our name's going to be in it.
Only, yeah, I guess you'd be a verified source. Well, if I say thank you, I'll put your name there. Thank you, Cameron. But there is no formal training for legislators. When I first got here, Cox Communication did a TV course. It was like about an hour-long course on how to do TV. I remember one of the things that they said was, you know, you always have to have makeup. And I actually have 3 buff beiges in my car, in my office, and in my home.
Well, I thought there were different seasons depending on, you know, your tan.
Maybelline buff beige, that's my thing. Because I'm telling you something, you know, if it's a high definition TV thing, you will look horrible. It's like unbelievable. But
I just put on the makeup before we came in today, John.
I do. I mean, I actually meet with everybody. I have women from the American Friends Service Committee of, you know, the West Valley, who want to meet with me on their social agenda, you know, and I know that the only result will be that, you know, that they would confirm that they would never ever vote for me. But I think, you know, people have a right to, you know, be heard by people. Plus, I like to engage and talk with people, and with the media, again, I think all publicity is good, and I also like to explain my positions. It's kind of interesting, you know, like the best place media to do an explanation is actually Horizon, because I'll get like, you know, 8-9 minutes there, which is actually an eternity, really. When there's a camera on you, 8 minutes is an eternity, right? You know, you go to like Politics Unplugged, and those things are like, yeah, it's all sound bites. Well, a little more than sound bites, right?
But I think the important question there, which we're all facing. Again, I started down here in '82. We could wander the halls, you know, there weren't security cards, the whole routine, and we got to know lawmakers. And there was also, we didn't have the heavy-duty hatred, I don't know what else to call it, that we did. There are people now, freshmen who come in, and try to get them to talk with you. They don't even know you, but it's this. Well, you're from the Fourth Estate. You know, you're the media. You are the enemy. And I'm just trying. You know, if I'm going up to Sina Kerr, if I'm going up to Shauna Bullock, I'm trying to get her perspective on something, but there's this total distrust. And I think the question becomes that we're asking is, you know, is it something, I will occasionally go to a more senior lawmaker and say, can you talk to so-and-so? But I don't know how we get past that.
You are the victims of national media. The bottom line is the national cable news shows, and even the national network shows, are unbelievably politicized. I mean, CNN is not balanced. CNN is liberal. MSNBC is totally off the wall. Fox is right wing. All their coverage is, and a lot of the big newspapers have very, very slanted coverage. And all of these Republicans, anyway, they're watching this, and they have an opinion that this is all the media. They haven't had any really exposures to you people, you know, because I mean, I don't think you're that way. There are a few. I mean, I know the Arizona Mirror is a real liberal slant to it. Although I've done a few interviews with them, and I thought they treated me pretty decently. But I think they're generalizing that you'll treat them just the way it's on the national news, and it's going to be spun, and you'll be cut and misworded. And I think if they're new, they're afraid. They don't know how to handle themselves. They don't know what to say.
Well, and like it used to be the only option. Like if you wanted your constituents to hear from you, you had to talk to the newspaper, and now you can just tweet at them. You can send them an email.
Absolutely.
There's
Do your own TikTok video. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the other thing. By the way, that may be that actually kind of brings me to my next thing. How much of a threat do you believe that AI in writing news stories is to your jobs, or people just totally abandoning your venues and just going to TikTok, which a lot of really young people do now?
They're two separate questions. AI, I've started to dabble and see, I'll put in a question just to check out an AI engine. And I asked a couple of AI things. What's the chance that Carrie Lake is going to be the next senator? And they come up with the usual drivel about, well, you can't tell, but there's this polling and everything else. And sometimes it can point you to something maybe you didn't notice. Let's like looking up something on Google. Oh, there's this poll from this group, and maybe they'll say something. AI will replace certain things. Look, AP, a lot of sports reporting on AP is being written by machines. You got this occurred in the third inning, this occurred in the fourth inning, and everything else, and that's occurring. Politics, it's a little harder. The issue of the alternatives, but that's all again what we're facing, to sort of what Hank's talking about, where candidates go directly to the media. You have clearly biased sites, whether it's Gateway Pundit or OANN or something like that. But this is a larger problem. And at the risk of getting on my soapbox, look, when I was growing up, when you were growing up, there was ABC, CBS, NBC, and there was usually a local educational station. Everyone pretty much got the same news. What was fact was fact. Walter Cronkite, Chet Hundley, David Brinkley, things like that. Now we are the proverbial 500 channels. Everybody gets to be a broadcaster, and people are only viewing the things that they agree with,
Right.
which creates a whole different problem in terms of when Mary Jo reports or I report that something occurred. Well, but I didn't see that on my news station. Well, no, if you're subscribed to Right Side Broadcasting Network, you're not going to see that. That's the bigger problem in terms of the trust and in terms of us getting out facts that we know, given our background, given the training we've done, the experience we have, that they won't listen to because it wasn't on RSBN or something.
Well, Hank, you're using AI, but purely for art.
Deep in the AI world. Not only for art. I use it, for example, what's Arizona's Resign to Run law? That it is so much better at answering questions like that than Google is. If I've got this obscure, knowledge in my head, but I need to pin it down. What's the ARS title on that? And you got to go check, make sure it's not hallucinating or that they haven't renumbered the statutes or whatever. But there's a lot of things like that we can use AI for that are purely beneficial. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where someday a lot of our reporting will be done, and that day is today or recently. A lot of our reporting is actually being done by AI. But it'll never be able to replace Howie or Mary Jo or Cameron. It can't even replace me at this point. I've tried to do, just as an experiment, full editions of ChatGPT writing the news. And I thought, you know what, it can't write stories. It doesn't have the context. It just, it can't write like a news story. But can it take this story that I'm reading from Mary Jo and I do, just a summary of the political stories you need to see today? And can I have it summarize a Mary Jo story for me? And I thought, it'll be able to do that. It can't. It can't yet. It cannot do a good enough job to even get to that level yet. And that's what, these large language models are best at, is summarizing information. But I'm working on another project. We've tapped into the legislature's API to scrape all the data of legislation as it moves through the process. House Bill 2001 got assigned to the Education Committee. And I'm looking at that right now and saying, man, I have this massive database of information. And what I can train it to do is tell people in a human voice what is happening from all this data. You look at that database of HB 2001 DP Cow. what the hell does that mean to a normal person? But a large language model can take that and say, House Bill 2001, which is about, housing policy, was assigned to the Education Committee where the, members include blah, blah, blah. It'll come up to a vote next week. Like, that's actually information that the average person can process. And I think that's one of the uses where, like, AI is going to be fantastic. Also, it does great art.
That's true. Well, let's close by saying, what would you say to students watching who say, I want to do what you're doing? They're in college, and what steps could I take to have a career like you have?
Well, I'd say come down and shadow a journalist, follow them around for a while so you understand what it takes. It's not really glamorous, what we do. And there is,
It can be.
but we all spend a lot of time, probably too much time, with butt in seat, in front of a keyboard, and get a broad education. You don't have to major in journalism, but have a broad base of knowledge and background, especially history.
And that's important because you're right. I took journalism courses. I don't know how much I learned there versus my first year at the Post-Standard. I learned probably a lot more there, working under an editor who says, no, this is the way it works. This isn't the way. They can teach you certain things in journalism, where to find public records and things like that. But it's people watch, All the President's Men. They all see that stuff. I mean, I started journalism before that, so I can't say that was the thing. But, you have, the old idea of hello, sweetheart could be rewrite. And this glamorous idea of what journalism is about. A lot of it is boring. I mean, I'm sitting here, we just got a new Supreme Court opinion that came in about legal fees in the Arizona Republican Party. This is not sexy, but it's important. And so, you have to understand that a lot of what you're doing is going to be a little mind-numbing, but it's important. And then the other thing is take, a creative writing course is really helpful, because one of the things that helped me is I spent a year at New Times, and we'll leave aside the politics of the organization under Mike Lacey. But when you're writing 7,000 or 8,000 word stories, you have to learn how to be interesting, how to keep the readers interested, how to transition from another action, which is the normal thing that we tend to do in journalism. But what makes you have to be a good reporter, but you have to be a good writer. We have had many good reporters at the Capitol who couldn't write their way out of a box. And if nobody's reading you, then it doesn't matter what you've done. So work on your writing also, and that's important.
And aside from the content of what you're writing and the words, is there a problem with new people not knowing grammar?
Oh, that's an issue. Of course, grammar is changing. Grammar is changing. One of the things that I haven't gotten used to yet is using they and them as a singular. I understand why that's an issue for certain people who are, non-binary or gender fluid or whatever the term is you want to call. That's me. That's me, old school. I can't do that. But it's changing. So even grammar changes. It's not static.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more important to be a good reporter than to be a good writer. I think you can sort of beat the reporter into being a good writer. You can edit them into being a better writer. But I think it's more important to have good reporting skills. Or maybe I'm just a bad writer.
That's why you're in radio now, right?
Yes.
35 seconds and out.
Yeah.
I guess, like, what scares me about the future of journalism more than AI or the general collapse of the industry is that there's going to be this huge hole someday when people like Mary Jo and Howie retire.
I'm not retiring. You're going to have to
when
take me out of the
Howie
box.
dies at his desk one day, there's going to be a huge hole in this industry. And there aren't a lot of people... there's you two.
But you mean longevity? Yeah.
Not like institutional knowledge, the ability to train young people. Like, I learned so much from watching you guys at press conferences, and the next generation of journalists won't have that, and there's just like kind of a missing generation right now happening in journalism. And I'm not sure when the next wave is coming. It might be missing generations. And when, that older generation moves out, there's going to be, people I'm in my mid-30s, late 30s. But, and I've been doing it most of my life, my adult life, so I have some institutional knowledge, but there aren't many in my generation, and that's going to be a huge hit to the journalism ecosystem.
Well, I would say anybody that's interested in becoming a journalist, you should pursue it. I mean, there are newspapers close, a lot of closed, they lay off. But, for all the people I've seen over the years leave the Republic, most of them wind up in another journalism capacity, and they all get employed. So it is not, people like to talk about it as a sinking ship, but it's more the vessel is shifting.
We're all out on lifeboats now, but there's plenty of lifeboats.
Yeah.
So anybody want to have any other thing to say before we
Well, I want to close out. Well, first of all, yes, institutional knowledge. I don't think I said it before, but obviously super important. I remember on my first day at the Cap Times, I sat down at my desk and my editor said, I want you to do a story on log rolling in the burbs.
Oh.
And I was like, I don't know. What did he just say?
Yes.
I don't know what that means. He said, I want you to interview Michelle Ugenti-Rita. I was like, I don't know who that is. I don't know how to get in contact with that person. I have no idea what I'm supposed to ask her. And I was like, did I make a huge mistake? Like, am I dumb? And, there were quite a few learning curves and things. Hank was one of the first people I met in Arizona. And I sat down, I was like, tell me everything you know. And we had coffee and
I ranted
taught.
for an hour and a half straight.
Yeah, and I was just like frantically taking notes. And I was like, okay.
Tell you everything I know. All right.
No, but it's so fabulous. I mean, everyone I know who's a journalist loves being a journalist, including myself. And I have a story-eyed view of it, but it's not boring. It's fabulous. And if you're interested even a tiny bit, just do it. Just do one story, or just try one class, or just do a little bit of it and, see if you like it. And of course you don't have to do it, but it's a public service. And it's so important that we have real journalists who care about, journalism and ethics and who want to be in this field. And I think it will continue forever. It's just, I agree that the medium's going to be shifting, but there's people like Hank who are finding their way. And then there's people like Mary Jo and Howie keeping it afloat. And so I am not too depressed.
Okay. Well,
Way to end.
yeah. Okay. So on another uplifting note, let me, as your instructor, just remind you that if you're still in your freshman or sophomore year, it's not too late to switch to a STEM major. All right. That's it. I want to thank my guests. They've been very helpful, and I hope they've been helpful to you. So that's it for this roundtable. Bye-bye.